Hello and welcome to this Carlton Academy Nazi Germany revision video. This one's going to be all about part 2, looking at the social policies and the impact that they had on German citizens. We're going to be looking at what it was like for workers, for women, young people, Jewish people, and people that didn't fit into the Nazi ideal society, for instance, people that were disabled as well. Now, this is going to be based on the information that is in your Nazi Germany revision pack. You should have already printed that last lesson if you have a printer. If you don't have a printer, it's the same rule as before, where you just want to listen to the video still, jot down some of the key notes, and you might also want to add some additional things that I'm saying as well onto your revision notes. If you do have a printer, obviously it's a little bit of an easier job because you're going to be highlighting the key points as we talk through it. But again, please do add some of the additional information that I'm going to talk to you about as we go through. First group that we're going to look at is we're going to think about what life was like for the workers. But in order to understand this, we are going to have to briefly talk about their economic policies. Now, this is something that we're going to cover in more detail in the part 3 video, but I'm just going to briefly talk to you today about their economic policies in order to give you the context that you need for the workers. So remember, the workers weren't really a group that necessarily supported the Nazis when they first came to power. They were much more likely to vote for parties like the SPD or the Communist Party. So the Nazis have to try and win them over. Now, first of all, we also need to know that when the Nazis came to power, the Great Depression was going on. Remember that there were at least 6 million people unemployed, and the Nazis had promised to end that by giving work and bread. Now, they do actually achieve a lot when it comes to reducing unemployment. They do this through things like the rearmament program. They get an extra 1.3 million jobs by 1939 by increasing the size of their army, because remember, it was only supposed to be 100,000 men. They also do things like introducing the National Labour Service Programme, the RAD, which gave compulsory 6 months training to all young men, getting them to build things like hospitals and autobahns, German motorways, but also it gave them some military training as well. And whilst they were doing that, they weren't counted as unemployed. So the Nazis did do a lot to try and help the workers, and they did try and end the Great Depression, but they also did cheat a little bit. So they claimed that they won the battle for work by 1936 and that they'd got rid of unemployment in Germany, but they cheated a bit by doing things like kicking women and Jewish people out of their jobs and then not counting those people as unemployed, even though they technically were. So we need to understand, first of all, the first of the Nazi economic policies about ending the Great Depression, because this is the background to looking at the workers. So you've now briefly thought about their short-term aim of solving the Great Depression and reducing the numbers of people that were unemployed in Germany. The other area of economic policy that you need to know about is what their longer-term aim was, and that was making Germany self-sufficient, making sure that they could produce enough food for all German civilians and that they could increase their production of key commodities needed for war, for instance, things like iron and steel, so they would never lose another war in the future because everything they needed would be produced within Germany itself. Now, I will be going over this long-term economic policy and the 4-year plan in the next video. You don't really need to know anything about it to understand their social policies and what they did for the workers, which is what we're focusing on today. So don't bother highlighting this slide or this bit of information in your revision pack if you've printed it out, and you don't need to make any notes on this now if you are if you didn't have a printer and if you're making your own notes as you go along. Don't have to put anything about this now. All you need to understand for the workers is that essentially the Nazis start putting pressure on people after 1936 to increase their production. And this has a really negative impact on the workers because it means that they have to work longer hours in the factories to try and achieve these aims. So that's all you need to know for this part of the video. I will go over economic policies and we'll go back to this information next lesson. We've thought about the background and their economic policies briefly. What we need to know now in lots of detail is what their policies towards the workers were actually like, and did their policies benefit and win round the workers? Now, first of all, that was one of the key Nazi aims. They need the workers on side. The workers made up 46% of the population, and they also didn't traditionally support the Nazis. They supported left-wing parties like the SPD. Nazis generally got a lot of support from the farmers and also the middle classes. So the Nazis need to try and win them over. They need to win them over so that they have less opposition, but also they need to make sure they have their support when it comes to things like their 4-year plan that they introduced in 1936. So they try and win them round. Let's think about what they did first of all in 1933. So remember that Hitler had been campaigning since 1930, after the onset of the Great Depression. He would provide work and bread if he was to become the Chancellor of Germany. So he immediately got to work in trying to provide that for people. And actually, for a lot of Aryan Germans, a lot of Germans that fit into Hitler's racial ideal, they did benefit from this policy of work and bread, and they did get jobs, often at the expense of women and Jewish people that were sacked. But again, for those Aryan Germans, they did feel like Hitler delivered on that promise. They also really liked the fact that the Nazis glorified the workers in their propaganda, and they praised them constantly. They released lots of propaganda posters saying what a good job they were doing for Germany and how they were the ones that were building Germany back up again. And that made them feel valued and therefore a lot more positive about the Nazis themselves. The Nazis wanted to reinforce this positivity, and so they created something called the Strength Through Joy organisation. This was an organisation that gave workers who hit their targets discounted holidays, theatre tickets, cinema tickets, and free sports events. So if you worked hard, if you hit the targets that they set, they would then reward you with all these different rewards. And therefore it made workers feel more positive about the Nazis and won them round. But it also made them work harder and made them more productive at work because they realised there was an incentive to work really hard. So the Nazis were giving workers more than they'd ever had before. Thinking back to when we looked at propaganda, we know that Goebbels liked to give out things like free or discounted radios, something he called the people's receiver. So that was something that was seen as a real luxury item at this point. Ordinary working class people couldn't necessarily afford a radio, and all of a sudden, through the Strength Through Joy movement, lots of people are getting this new luxury item. There's also things like cars as well. Nazis say that workers that work really hard can buy into this system and in the end get a Volkswagen car. Now, they never actually gave out a single one of these, but the workers felt that they were going to get one, and therefore they felt very positive that the Nazis were giving them more opportunities than any other working class person had ever had. You can also see how popular this scheme was by looking at the amount of holidays that had been taken by 1939. 10 million holidays were taken as a result of the Strength Through Joy movement. So there were loads of positives for the workers. There were lots of people that now had jobs. Bosses couldn't easily sack workers. They had to go to the government if they wanted to sack someone. And actually, they also introduced something called the Beauty of Labour movement, which improved conditions in these factories and places of work. For instance, they would build nicer facilities like toilets, low-cost canteens, and obviously there was all the positive rewards of things like free theatre tickets and stuff if you worked hard. So generally we need to understand that for ordinary workers, they did benefit quite a lot from Nazi policies. They felt valued, they had access to goods that they'd never had before, they'd gone on some holidays that they'd never been on before. There were some positives for ordinary workers. However, there were also some negatives that we need to understand. So first of all, one of the key negatives to understand is that the workers just don't have the representation that they used to have before. Because remember that the Nazis had banned trade unions using the Enabling Act in May 1933. They'd done that to please all the business people that had supported them and funded Nazi propaganda. And the Nazis replaced trade unions, which fight for the rights of workers, with their own organisation called the German Labour Front, or DAF. Now, this made things worse for the workers, though, because now strikes were illegal, and workers also couldn't leave a job without the government's permission. So if you wanted to take a different job somewhere else, you would have to get the government's permission before you could do that. Furthermore, we know that the Nazis' economic aim of making Germany self-sufficient in 4 years meant that people had to work even longer hours in places like the factories. The German Labour Front, the DAF, got rid of the maximum working hours, which had been set in Weimar at 8 hours, and instead, by 1939, many Germans found themselves working between 60 and 72 hours a week. Now think about how long school sometimes feels for you, and think about the fact that at school, you're only really there for about 30 hours a week. So you can imagine how long these hours were for workers. So generally, their working conditions worsened, their wages fell because they weren't allowed to increase, and they were having to work for longer hours. So there was some opposition from some workers about this, but the reason why there wasn't this kind of mass opposition is because most people had been placated by things like the Strength Through Joy movement. So generally, policies towards the workers were fairly popular with them. They felt that they benefited from it. There was some low-scale grumbling from some workers thinking that they hadn't benefited from Nazi policies, but the majority of people were won round, at least enough to not join any kind of opposition group. So that's what you need to know about the workers. You might want to pause here and make some notes if you want to. The next area that you need to know about is women and how Nazi policies affected them. Now, there have been some major changes for women in the 1920s in the period of Weimar. Women have had a lot more freedom than ever before. Many more of them had got jobs and were much more career-driven than in the past. Nazis hated these changes, though, and they wanted to reverse them straight away. They'd been really worried about the declining birth rate, and so they wanted women to start focusing again on being traditional in their role, being wives and mothers. So they asked them to focus on the 3 Ks, and that was about children, church, and cooking. So they tried to encourage them to focus on having lots of children in a few different ways. First of all, they gave out loans of 1,000 marks if you had 4 children. This was because one of the reasons that many women hesitated is because children tend to be quite expensive. So the Nazis passed this law for the encouragement of marriage. It would give you 250 marks that you were allowed to keep for each child that you had. 1,000 marks might not sound very much, but it's the equivalent of 9 months' wages, about £18,000 in today's money. So it was a lot of money. They also tried to celebrate motherhood, and every year on Hitler's mother's birthday, they held an award ceremony, the Motherhood Cross. And this is where they would give you a medal depending on how many children you had. If you had 8 children, you get a gold medal. If you had 6 children, you get silver. And if you had 4, you would get a bronze medal. So they encouraged women to have lots of kids through this celebration of motherhood. They also even introduced something quite extreme called the Lebensborn program. Now, at this point in the 1930s, if you were pregnant outside of marriage, there would have been a real kind of sense of shame in the community at that point. So Nazis introduced homes for unmarried mothers in the hope that they wouldn't then try and abort their children. Because remember, the pressures were very different for women at that point, and it was seen as a real shame on your family to have a child out of wedlock. So the Nazis opened these homes for unmarried mothers, Spring of Life or Lebensborn programs. But later on, during the Second World War, these places actually became brothels where women would go deliberately to get pregnant by a racially pure SS officer. Nazis didn't just try and encourage some women to have children, they actively tried to stop other women from having children. And women that didn't fit into their racial ideal, women that weren't part of the Aryan race, or women that had some kind of hereditary illness, for instance, if they were hereditary deaf, the Nazis then sterilised these people from the age of 10 to try and stop them having children that wouldn't be, as the Nazis saw, healthy enough for society. So there were some positive things for women to encourage them to have children, but there was also a really negative impact on lots of women who were sterilised, or some women who couldn't have children were then shamed as if they weren't fulfilling their role. Now, Nazis didn't just want women to be wives and mothers. That also then means that they don't want them to have jobs. So they essentially forced people to leave their jobs from 1933. Female doctors, lawyers, all these kind of career-minded women were forced out of these jobs that they'd worked really hard for. Women were allowed to continue with certain jobs that were seen as female-specific, for instance, being a midwife, but most jobs they weren't allowed to be part of. Weren't even allowed to do things anymore like jury service, as women were seen as too emotional for this. Essentially, all that progress with equality that was made in the 1920s was reversed by the Nazis. Women couldn't even decide exactly how they wanted to look. They weren't allowed to do things like smoking, they weren't allowed to wear things like trousers, they were expected to have plaited hair, no makeup, and they were even supposed to be a certain weight so that it could be healthy for childbearing. Now, even though from a modern point of view, a lot of us would look at these policies with horror, actually at the time, most women welcomed these changes and liked the fact that we're going back to a more traditional role. Another key group for the Nazis to control was young people. Now, the Nazis had wanted to create a 1,000-year Reich, and so indoctrinating the youth was absolutely essential. They believed it was much easier to brainwash a child and make them politically loyal than it was an adult. And so in order to secure the future of Nazi Germany, they needed to make sure that young people grew up really supportive of Nazi ideology. And they try and push this through in two different areas. First of all, they make sure that schools and the education system is teaching Nazi ideals. And second of all, they controlled young people in their time outside of school through the Hitler Youth and the League of German Maidens. So let's think first of all about education and how they controlled what was going on there. Well, they wanted to drastically change the curriculum, and they rewrote textbooks as well to make sure that they only taught Nazi ideals. Teachers were also controlled because they were expected to be part of the National Socialist Teachers League. If they refused to join, or if they were somebody that wasn't politically reliable, they would be fired. They also completely changed the curriculum, and they made sure that each subject reflected their ideology. For instance, in a geography lesson, students would be taught about Lebensraum, this idea of having living space in the East, and that it was right for Germany to be able to conquer other lands to give more space for German people. Even in maths, it was very much about pushing forward their political views. For instance, they used to have a lot of questions that were based on costing how much mentally and physically disabled people cost Germany. They also had things like questions where they would ask them to calculate angles. They were talking about dropping bombs on places like Poland. So every subject had a real emphasis on Nazi ideals. History, they would talk about things like the stab in the back myth and the fact that the Weimar politicians were the November criminals. In science lessons, they would teach about the fake science of eugenics, definitely not real science, where they would teach about there being different ideas and different races having different strengths, and they would talk about why the Aryan race was superior in their mind as well. So all of their lessons very much reflected Nazi ideology. But they also wanted to control their free time, and they did this through the Hitler Youth. Now, the Hitler Youth had actually been around since 1925, but as the Nazis came to power, this group got more and more popular. The Nazis wanted all of the young people to be in it, because then it would train them for their future roles in society. Boys in the Hitler Youth would train for the army, and they would do lots of military drills. And girls would be part of the sister organisation of the League of German Maidens. There they would be taught to be good wives and mothers. They would be doing lots of things like gymnastics to keep them fit for childbirth. So the idea is that they're reinforcing those gender roles through the Hitler Youth organisations. Now in 1936, they then closed down all the other youth organisations. So people only have one choice. If you want to do something outside of school and you want to join a club, there is now only the Hitler Youth. Most young people didn't mind that at that point though, and it's estimated that 95% of the youth supported the Nazis, at least at first. There was loads of positives for young people at this point. They liked the free camping trips, they liked the fact that they felt valued, and they felt powerful as well, because they knew that they could tell on their teachers or their parents and get them arrested. So there was a real sense of lots of young people enjoying the power and enjoying the activities that they got to do for free. However, in 1939, 6 years after the Nazis have come to power, they are less popular with young people because they make membership to the Hitler Youth compulsory. They say everyone has to join. Now, a lot of young people didn't like the fact they now had to give up their weekends to go on the Hitler Youth camping trips, and they had to give up some of their weeknights as well. So there starts to be some more youth opposition from 1939, even though for the most part, people generally still supported the Nazis. You do need to be aware of some of the youth opposition groups that I'll talk more about in the part 3 video. There were some groups, for instance, the Swing Youth, that just wanted to listen to things like jazz music that had been banned by the Nazis. There were also some other groups, like the White Rose, that was created in World War II, that was about wider opposition to the Nazis and not just about a small amount of their policies. So overall, young people broadly supported the Nazis and liked these changes, but they definitely were indoctrinated through the Hitler Youth and the education programs. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes about them. The next area that you need to know about is Nazi religious policies and what they did to the Catholic and Protestant Church. You can see that this has been divided into these two areas, and it's important that you know the differences in their policies towards the Catholics and the Protestants. Now, overall, the Nazis generally didn't like religion because it was an alternative ideology. It didn't fit with their ideals and they wanted to control the people. But they can't just get rid of the church straight away because that would lead to some outrage and could lead to mass opposition. So they have to try and weaken the influence of the church over time. So let's first of all think about their policies towards the Catholics. Now, the Nazis found it difficult to deal with the Catholics. They were a group that had a foreign influence from the Pope. Remember, they all listened to the Pope. And also, they were a group that had their own political party, the Centre Party. So they weren't generally people that supported the Nazis. Most of the people that voted for the Nazis in 1932 and 1933 were actually Protestants. So they've got to be very careful with the Catholics because they've got to try and win them round, and they've also got to try and make sure they're on good terms with the Pope, and they can't control him very easily because he's not living in Germany. So at first, the Nazis cooperate and compromise with the Catholic Church. In July 1933, they signed the Concordat, which you might remember from when we looked at how Hitler became a dictator. This was an agreement between the Catholic Church and the Nazis, where the Catholics agreed to stay out of politics and get rid of their Centre Party, and in return, the Nazis agreed that they would leave Catholic youth groups and schools alone. So it was this compromise that was made at first. However, Hitler couldn't be trusted to keep his word. By 1935, 2 years after the Concordat was signed, Hitler started doing things like attacking Christian schools, he was doing things like removing crucifixes, and in 1936, he made the Hitler Youth the only youth group. We got rid of their Catholic youth groups. The Catholics were incredibly unhappy about this and the fact that the Nazis had threatened their independence, and they responded by criticising the Nazis. Lots of Catholic bishops in their Sunday sermons said negative things about the Nazis, and Hitler then responded by arresting those Catholic bishops. In 1937, the Pope got involved and he wrote a letter called With Burning Concern or With Burning Grief, which criticised the Nazis and said what they were doing was wrong. Hitler, rather than stopping, just responded with increased repression, and he does things like closing down Catholic monasteries, spied on the church leaders, and did things like closing down their Catholic schools. So Catholics have tried opposing the Nazis, and it's not really been very successful. Generally, Nazis aren't fazed by this and just respond with arrests, and the Catholic population don't really do anything to stop this either. One really good example, though, of where some Catholics did rise up was von Galen in 1941, who had found out about the Nazi policy of euthanasia, where they were murdering disabled people. And when he found out, he started giving all these public sermons saying about what they were doing. The Nazis, because it was during the Second World War and they needed everybody on side to help them win it, ended up temporarily stopping the killings because they didn't want to lose support during the war. So that's an example there of actually a really effective version of opposition where somebody is criticising it and the Nazis stop. So generally, the Catholic Church probably could have done more to oppose the Nazis. Never opposed them on a wide scale about all of their policies, for instance, what they were doing to Jewish people. They did, however, stand up for their own independence of their schools and youth organisations, and obviously von Galen also publicly protested against euthanasia. The other area that we need to know about is what were their policies like towards the Protestant Church. Now, generally, Nazis preferred the Protestant Church because, first of all, there was no foreign leader like the Pope, and second of all, a lot of their support came from the Protestant population. The Protestant Church also wasn't just one united church with one leader. It was actually 28 different branches, all ever so slightly different. And therefore, Nazis thought that what they would do to try and control them effectively is to create one single Protestant church called the Reich Church. And they do that straight away when they come to power in 1933. This Reich Church was basically controlled by the Nazi government, and it followed all of the Nazi ideas, had things like swastikas put in their churches, and they would do things like the Heil Hitler greeting when they saw each other. So generally, the Nazis found it quite easy to control the Protestants because they just united them into one Nazified church. However, not all of the Protestant leaders were happy about that. For instance, Niemöller and Bonhoeffer were two Protestant priests who were very unhappy with that policy of linking the church and the state. And so they established their own anti-Nazi church called the Confessional Church, which campaigned against Nazi policies. And 5,000 out of 17,000 Protestant leaders joined that opposition church called the Confessional Church. Now, just like with the Catholics, when the Protestants are rising up against them, the Nazis respond with repression, and they end up arresting 700 of the church leaders. However, generally, the Nazis are more successful at controlling the Protestants than the Catholics. They find it easier to be able to control them. So if we think about their overall aim, we know that the Nazis had wanted to weaken the influence of both churches. They had achieved that to an extent, but people were still going there. But they certainly found it much easier to control the Protestants than the Catholics. You might want to pause the video here if you want to make some notes about their policies towards both churches. The next area that you need to know about is the policies towards Jewish people in Germany. Now, as we already know, the Nazis were incredibly anti-Semitic, and they believed in this idea of an Aryan master German race, and they believed that Jewish people didn't fit into this. They saw them as part of a group of people called the Untermenschen, which means the subhumans, and they saw Jewish people as a racial and biological threat to Germany. Now, there was actually relatively few Jewish people in Germany, only about 500,000 and less than 1% of the population. But these people were blamed for all of Germany's problems. The Nazis blamed them for the loss of the First World War, the signing of the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, and all the economic problems that came after, for instance, hyperinflation. So they started persecuting Jewish people right from the beginning of when they came to power. And you can see there are three different phases of their policies towards Jewish people. It started with this phase of discrimination between 1933 to 1937. It then turned violent with the outbreak of the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, and by 1942 it had become a phase called the Final Solution. We'll talk about what they did to Jewish people through these three different phases. Nazis came to power in January 1933, and they immediately began discriminating against the Jewish people. They started acting at first quite cautiously, as they didn't know how the German public would react, and so they began by boycotting Jewish businesses from the 1st of April. This is where the brown shirts, the SA, stood outside and intimidated shoppers, so this was a measure that was supposed to harm Jewish people financially. They also then pushed them out of lots of different jobs, including pushing Jews out of the civil servants, being lawyers, and they could no longer be doctors that treated Aryan German patients. They could now only treat other Jewish people. As a result of this level of discrimination, 37,000 Jewish people left Germany, often not being able to leave with more than about 1,000 marks and only with what they could carry. Some people made the very difficult decision to leave at that point. Other people stayed, hoping that things wouldn't get any worse, but they did in September 1935 when the Nazis passed the Nuremberg laws. These said you could only be counted as a German citizen if you had what they deemed as purely German blood. As Jewish people were defined as un-German, therefore lost their civil rights and became second-class citizens. Laws were passed, for instance, that said Jewish people couldn't marry Aryans, and if you were already together, you would be separated. If you refused to separate, you could end up in a concentration camp. Now, there were those two official Nuremberg laws saying that you could only be a German citizen if you had German blood, and saying that you couldn't marry an Aryan citizen if you didn't have the German blood. But they also introduced loads of unofficial Nuremberg-style laws all over Germany that banned Jewish people from restaurants, parks, walking on the pavement, swimming pools. Lots of different places that Jewish people could no longer go. The point was that the Nazis wanted to socially isolate them. They wanted people to see Jewish people as somehow different and separate, and they didn't want Jewish and non-Jewish people being together anymore. So by 1935, Jewish people had already had to put up with horrific levels of discrimination. But things get even worse over time, as the German population didn't react badly to the boycotts or the Nuremberg laws. There was no opposition from them, and therefore the Nazis became more extreme over time. Nazi policies towards the Jews turned violent in November 1938 with an event called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. During this night, Jewish businesses, homes and synagogues were destroyed in an act of coordinated violence and outpouring of hatred against the innocent Jewish community. 91 Jewish people were killed in this night. 30,000 more were arrested and sent to concentration camps for the apparent crime of being Jewish. Concentration camps had existed before this, but they had been used to house political prisoners, people that opposed the Nazis, and now Jewish people are being put in them just for being Jewish. This is a terrible event and one that horrified the Jewish community. The fact that their businesses had been burnt down, their homes had been destroyed, and over 250 synagogues had been destroyed as well. The whole point of this was to terrorize the Jewish community and make them try and leave Germany, and many of them really did try, but the problem was that other countries wouldn't accept them. So they really struggled to be able to leave. Things get even worse in 1939 after World War II breaks out. Now, the Nazis already believed that they had a Jewish problem when they had 500,000 Jews. As they start to invade other nations, the Jewish population grows. For instance, in Poland and the Soviet Union, there were over 3 million Jewish people that lived there. The Nazis' new solution to trying to deal with what they called their Jewish problem was to put them into ghettos. These were areas of the city that they cornered off, they put Jews in, and then they walled them up in there. They were crowded, there wasn't enough food, and over 500,000 people died due to starvation and disease in these ghettos. Conditions were horrendous and deliberately so, to try and make sure that as many Jewish people died as possible. In 1941, as well as having this policy of ghettos, they also started the mass shooting squads called the Eisengruppen. These were groups of people that went into the Eastern territories, places like Lithuania and Poland, rounded up Jewish people and executed them there and then. 1 million innocent Jewish men, women and children were murdered in this way. So you can see this period of 1938 to 1941 is a horrendous one of violence and the murder, either directly or indirectly, of so many innocent people. Nazis had already murdered so many Jewish people before 1942, but things get even worse then when they make what they call their final solution to the Jewish problem, a decision in which they plan to kill all of Europe's Jews, all 11 million of them. And at this meeting that's held in somewhere called Wannsee, just outside of Berlin, they coordinate the logistics of murdering all these people. And they decide that they're going to try and murder up to 60,000 innocent people a day. They're going to do this through purpose-built extermination camps, places that you might have heard of before like Auschwitz, and over 1 million people are killed on that site alone. As a result of this terrible policy of the final solution, 6 million Jewish people have been killed by the Nazis by 1945. That's what you need to know about the policies towards the Jews. Pause here if you need to make any notes. You've seen about the final solution, which technically began after January 1942 with the Wannsee Conference and them deciding to try and murder 11 million European Jews. You've seen the reality of it with 6 million people that had been murdered by the Nazis that were Jewish. But we're also now going to think for this final bit of the lesson about the other victims of the Holocaust. There are 6 million Jewish people that perish in these terrible camps from starvation or execution. But there's also another 5 million people that are murdered by the Nazis in these areas. So in total, the Nazis had 11 million people that they murdered in so many brutal ways. Now we're going to talk about these other groups, and I'd like you, once I finish talking through it, to pause the video and make a spider diagram of the other groups and how they were persecuted by the Nazis. The main information is on the board here, but you can also add, if you want to, the extra things I'm going to say about each of these groups. So first of all, I want to talk to you about the Roma and the Sinti, otherwise sometimes known as the Gypsies. Now we have to be aware that these groups of people were subjected to much of the same treatment as Jewish people. The Nazis viewed the Jews as a biological threat to the Aryan race, and they viewed the Roma and the Sinti as the same, as a threat to the Aryan race. So things like the Nuremberg laws we looked at in 1935 that made Jews second-class citizens and stopped them from marrying Aryans, those same laws were actually applied to people that were Roma and Sinti. So they were also targeted for discrimination. Basically, everything that happened to Jewish people also happened to them too, and they were also sent to extermination camps. It's estimated that about 500,000 European gypsies were murdered, just like the Jews, in these same forms with things like gassings. So the Roma and Sinti were really badly treated by the Nazis. There's less talked about with them and there's less known about it because there hasn't been as many charities that have focused on the response to the Nazi policies towards the Roma and Sinti, but that doesn't mean it's any less important. And if you're interested in knowing more, please just message me and I can send you some really interesting information about what happened to so many innocent Roma and Sinti people. The next group that you need to know about are the asocials. These are people that the Nazis classed as people not fitting into their ideal society. For instance, people that were work shy, that were unemployed, people that were alcoholics, prostitutes, or homosexual. These people were supposedly to the Nazis a threat to their society, and they therefore wanted to try and re-educate them. So they rounded them up in 1936 before the Berlin Olympics and put them into concentration camps. The idea was that they'd release them after a few years when they'd learnt to behave better. So, for instance, many innocent gay people were rounded up, put in concentration camps, and had to wear a pink triangle that showed that they were in there because they were gay. They suffered really brutal treatment, and the guards knew exactly what their apparent crime was, according to them, and they would treat them accordingly. So homosexuals in particular were very badly treated by the Nazis. And they did this because they felt that people that were gay were a threat to their nation. Remember, the Nazis were incredibly worried about the declining birth rate, and that's why they had so many policies to encourage women to have lots of children. Now, it's not only people that are asocials that are horrendously treated, but it's also people that were physically or mentally disabled. People that had a hereditary illness, that's one that could pass to the next generation. They were sterilised from 1933. About 400,000 people were forcibly sterilised, and they had the right and ability to have children taken away from them. And that could happen to you from the age of 13. So there's a lot of people who had their whole futures determined by the Nazis from 1933. Even worse, in 1939, the Nazis decide that sterilising these people isn't going far enough, and they saw them as such a threat to the race that they decided to murder people through a policy of euthanasia. So people with disabilities, particularly if they were hereditary, were murdered, often through gassings, but in some cases through a policy of starvation. Their families would be told that they were getting the best medical treatment, but then they would carry out these murders and then tell them that they had died of some kind of infection. So ordinary German people, people that were supposedly of the Aryan race, are still murdered by the Nazis if they're seen as a threat to the race in any way. For instance, being disabled would have been seen as a threat. By 1944, the Nazis had murdered 200,000 people, adults and children, through this policy of euthanasia. And most argue that the gas that they used here was the origins of the Holocaust and gave them the idea, which they then later applied to Jewish people from the end of 1941 to the beginning of 1942. So it isn't just Jewish people that experience the horrors of the Nazis and have, these brutal treatments and, being treated so inhumanely. It happens to many different groups. However, obviously the scale of what happens to Jewish people means that we often do focus on that because we're thinking about those 6 million Jewish people that have been murdered. But remember, there are also millions of other people from different minorities that are persecuted and murdered by the Nazis. Now come to the end for the information on social policies. It's worth just making sure that you really understand the content and that you can answer all these questions before you move on. So there are 11 questions on here. There's some more questions on the next slide as well. It's worth just pausing the video and either writing down brief answers for these or even just saying the answers out loud. Either way, make sure you're comfortable with this content before you move on. If there's questions that you can't answer, you can always go back to the video and listen to those sections again in the future as well. Here is the second slide of questions. This is what we would have done in the short answer test if we were in lesson. So have a little look at these questions and again, just make sure you can answer them all before you move on. The answers will be coming up on the next slide. Here are the answers. It's just worth double checking what you've got against these. Obviously, you might not have the exact answer that we've got on here. This is just some ideas. For instance, for some questions like question 4, you might have talked about different ideas. For instance, what they did in geography lessons or history lessons. That would still be fine, but at least you've got here some answers to be able to check your answers against. And here are the answers for the last few questions as well. Thank you so much for listening to the video about Nazi social policies. It would be a really good idea to now go and do something with it. For instance, you could make a revision clock or a mind map about those social policies using these 12 headings that we've put on the board here. So in the workers section, you could then think about writing down what their main policies were, what were the positives for the workers, what were the negatives. Women, personally, I would divide this into two areas so that you can think about their policies towards work and also wives and mothers. For youth, I'd think about education policies first, and then I'd do a separate section on how they control them outside of education. For religion, you could break it down into those two defined areas as well. When you're looking at the policies towards Jewish people, you could divide it into those three distinct phases that we talked about. And then for the final two categories, you can think about their treatment of minorities, including disabled people, and then you could talk about asocials and the Roma and Sinti in the final category. That would be a really good idea to make a revision material that you can use in the future for any mocks or real exams.